30 years ago, the Dayton Peace Accords brought an end to the war in Bosnia, the most brutal conflict Europe had seen since the end of the Second World War. But while the deal stopped the killing, did it really deliver a sustainable peace? 3 decades on, Bosnia remains deeply divided, politically paralysed, and haunted by fears that instability or even conflict could yet return. So, how should we judge Dayton today? Was it a necessary compromise that saved lives, or a settlement that locked in division and dysfunction? To explore these questions, I'm joined by Ian Bancroft, author, analyst, and a former diplomat who spent much of his career living and working in the Balkans. So, hi Ian, thanks so much for joining us. I guess the best place to start is perhaps do a recap of the Bosnia War and exactly what Dayton agreed and what the settlement, how it was reached and what the settlement really put in place.
Well, James, firstly, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to finally have the chance to appear on your channel. Yeah, I mean, the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina came about as a result of the breakup of the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. So from April 1992 until December 1995, there was a war that was categorized by, in the early phases, ethnic cleansing, particularly of Bosniaks in the east of the country, and the war, a campaign of shelling of towns and cities. One of the most shocking features, I think, of the war is, the use of systematic mass rape. And these crimes were mainly perpetrated by Bosnian Serbs. As you'll see from the war crimes verdicts in the Hague Tribunal, the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, and to a lesser extent, Croats and Bosniak forces. So in the period of the war, about 100,000 people were killed. There are some very specific records of the numbers and the distinction between civilian victims and military victims. And about 2 million people were displaced, either internally within the country or becoming refugees. That sort of social fabric, the intercommunity relations that had long sort of epitomized Bosnia and Herzegovina were basically shattered. Multi-ethnic communities were replaced by mono-ethnic communities as a result of the war. The culmination of the war, I think, was, 11th of July, 1995, the Srebrenica genocide, where over 8,000 predominantly Bosniak men and boys were killed by Bosnian Serb forces. It was the single largest mass murder in Europe since World War II. And by the autumn of 1995, it had reached a situation on the ground with there'd been an agreement between the Bosniaks and the Croats in 1994 to unify their efforts. And they began pushing back the Bosnian Serb forces. And, Holbrooke, who was leading this process to try and reach a peace settlement, was looking at the situation on the ground, how it looked in reality. And it was felt that after the fall of, I think it was Sanski Most, that this was the juncture where there was a sort of balance of power on the ground, where an agreement could be potentially struck. And so the parties were convened in Dayton, Ohio, a team of, American lawyers, diplomats from Western powers, banged heads together, and we have what we celebrated yesterday, or marked yesterday, the Dayton Peace Accords. Now, obviously, there are, the Dayton Peace Accords, as Holbrooke's book itself, were designed to end a war. And in that respect, they've been extremely successful. One of the prime criticisms, of course, is that for some, they basically enshrined the results of the war, the ethnic cleansing, the de facto segregation, the existence of Republika Srpska. And so for many, it was a necessary step, but a step that the country has had to live with ever since. Obviously, Bosnia and Herzegovina's constitution is an annex to that peace agreement. And this constitution has, for many proven a straitjacket over the year. I mean, we can run into a few of the factors in the rest of this conversation. So I think, when you look at Dayton from that perspective of where things were in 1995, it should be celebrated, and we can explore, where missteps were made in terms of moving forward. I think it's important, as a friend of mine recently wrote. I mean, and Dayton always attracts a lot of interest, particularly because we, as a potential model for the settlement of other conflicts. And I think, in comparison to what we're seeing today in terms of how peace is discussed, it's important to stress just to what extent human rights formed the basis of the Dayton Peace Accords. The European Court of Human Rights, trumping legislation in BIH, the right of return, which I think was quite an important, people given, either the right to return to their property. Now, obviously, that happened to a certain extent, but the right to have compensation for what you'd lost during wartime, I think, was an important step.
Obviously we'll delve a little deeper into some of the issues, but I think perhaps first is this question that, as you said, it's just marked that 30th anniversary. What's been the reaction within Bosnia and more widely regionally? Have we heard things from Croatia, from Serbia? What have been the official reactions and also the public reactions? How have people felt about this looking back?
I think in general, there's quite a lot of fatigue. I mean, I think if you asked people 20 years ago where they thought BIH, Bosnia and Herzegovina, would be at this juncture, they wouldn't expect the country to still be beholden to this constitution that was determined in Dayton. Now, the main celebrators of the Dayton Peace Agreement are the Bosnian Serbs. They argue that this is the document that legitimizes the existence of Republika Srpska, and their main critique is that actually, there are many who advocate for going back to the original Dayton document, because a lot of progress was made in terms of how Dayton was refined. I think the most notable point was the unification of the armed forces. After the war, there were different armed forces, and they were unified in about 2004. There was also the creation of an indirect taxation authority, giving the state level institutions an independent source of financing. So for the Bosnian Serbs, it's often celebrated, Dayton as a success, and it's the document that they constantly point towards in discussions over the future of BIH. From a Bosniak point of view, there's a very strong movement advocating for the creation of a more civically oriented Bosnia and Herzegovina. There's a lot of resentment about the idea of constituent nations or constituent peoples being the driving force, the driving logic behind how the state operates. The state, those three constituent peoples being the Bosniaks, the Bosnian Croats, and the Bosnian Serbs. And that ethnic key now runs through, almost every decision that is taken in the country. Employment decisions, political decisions, and there's a great deal of frustration that there hasn't been the emergence of a community that identifies with being Bosnian and Herzegovinian, and having a more civic orientation. For Bosnia's Croats and for Croatia, there's also a feeling of resentment that they were never rewarded with a third entity. They resent that the Serbs have Republika Srpska and would prefer to have their own entity, to break up the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, which is divided into 10 cantons, and to have their own entity. There's also, they've had critiques about, without getting too much into the complications of Dayton, but they've been advocating this idea of who is a legitimate representative of the Bosnian Croat community. There is an individual, Željko Komšić, who's come to power in the presidency on occasion and captured Bosnian Croat votes, and used Bosniak votes to take the position of the Bosnian Croat member of the presidency. You have, of course, those who have no possibility to sit in higher office. If you're a member of the Jewish community, the Roma community, other minorities, if you don't identify with one of those constituent peoples, then you are excluded from being in government. So there's a lot of dissatisfaction with Dayton amongst the vast majority, in a sense that it's just stubbornly immune to change. Here we are 30 years on, and we're still hamstrung. The country is still hamstrung with the same document that brought an end to the war. 20 years ago, next year, there was the April 2006 package that was on the table. A series of constitutional reforms that would have most importantly strengthened the state level institutions, created new ministries, etc. It failed by, I think, 2 votes. And I think there was a sense at the time that that package would come back to the table, after the elections that year. But here we are 20 years on and nobody talks about constitutional reform. The conversation is dead. And I think it's, in terms of reflections 30 years on, it's not just about Dayton, the document itself. I think it's also a question about the role of the High Representative and the bomb powers that he still exercises, which, of course, are fundamentally incompatible with Bosnia and Herzegovina's ambitions to become an EU member state. They're virtually unprecedented. The idea that an individual can, impose legislation, can remove officials, elected officials, and whilst that may have been necessary in the immediate years after the war, here we are now 30 years on, and there are really fundamental questions about whether that post can still be justified. Those bomb powers were not created at Dayton. They were created afterwards, but they were deemed to be necessary to try to unlock the obstructionism that was preventing the implementation of the Dayton Peace Agreement. So in that sense, there's not a great deal of fanfare. I think, most of what I've seen and read comes from, the international community, who see Dayton as a sort of laboratory in terms of post-war, a post-war settlement and a pathway towards reconstruction. And there are a lot of great successes. I mean, despite the tensions over, questions about the secession of the RS and frustrations within the Bosnian Croat community, there is a sense of peace that I think prevails on a day-to-day basis. There is, the massive international community presence that was on the ground after the war was never targeted. It was never viewed as a sort of occupying power. It was there, with a great deal of legitimacy. And that has sort of continued. There are very few acts of violence. Despite the very heated rhetoric and the very difficult political situation. And I think that is a testament to how far Bosnia and Herzegovina has come. You will read every year a headline saying, is Bosnia and Herzegovina on the verge of war? I mean, I've been reading these headlines every year for the past 20 years. And so, BIH and its institutions has proved more resilient than maybe people might have expected. But I wouldn't underestimate, particularly the psychological impact that the war in, Russia's invasion of Ukraine has had. And also now this sense of, how committed is the international community to upholding the certain guarantees that it's given previously. And that has multiple dimensions. It has, a question of military deployments, over the horizon deployments, but it's also a question about, the promise of a European future for Bosnia and Herzegovina.
So what I'm getting is a message that it's sort of there hasn't been a lot of celebration that's going on. It's sort of it's one of those things that's been marked. But of course, as you sort of mentioned, there were some incredible positive outcomes, not just, the end of the fighting, but I think, that first decade or so, actually the country seemed to see a lot of progress. You'd sort of mentioned about sort of military reform and coming together. Perhaps outline just exactly some of the progress that was made, for example, with refugee returns, which was a huge question after the war, as you'd sort of mentioned in your opening comments about the ethnic cleansing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it shouldn't be underestimated. It's very easy to be very gloomy about BIH and what was achieved, and the frustrations are very legitimate. But I think if you do look at that first decade after the war, I mean, there was one incredibly simple move, which was to create common license plates, which had no denominations that you couldn't tell to which ethnic community a person belonged, and this had an enormous impact in terms of freedom of movement in the years after the war. People could travel freely throughout the country without fear of being targeted or being identified. As you say, the returns process, it hasn't achieved the romantic goal, which was to restore Bosnia's diversity to the state it was, prior to the war. But as far as I understand, I think 1 million people have enjoyed the right to return of their property rights, and whatever they did subsequently, either sold or swapped apartments or houses, the important thing is they had recognition for the fact that they were moved out of their properties during the war. And there are some pockets of success in terms of returnee communities. There are still challenges and tensions and whatnot, but I think that the fact that the right to return was enshrined at the heart of Dayton, and many human rights lawyers who really worked vociferously on its implementation is really a testament. The creation of certain common institutions, a border service, a single passport, as I said, the indirect taxation authority that gives the state independent sources of financing. The unification of the armed forces obviously was a huge step forward in terms of peace and stability on the ground, and basically precluding the possibility of a return to conflict unless Bosnia's neighbors would decide otherwise. I think in terms of confidence building, that was a very vital step, and many of those moves did require the intervention of the international community, and I think there was a certain justification for that sort of more heavy-handed implementation in the years after the war. Obviously, there are a lot of shortcomings, though. I mean, in terms of education, young people are growing up learning different histories. The process of reconciliation, I mean, there's still a lot of denial of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and most notably the Srebrenica genocide. And the fact that young people are growing up in those mono-ethnic communities means that there is, even though BIH has the same language, there's a great deal of distance between communities. And I think that's an issue that's going to take generations to resolve. I mean, it's not a problem that's unique to Bosnia and Herzegovina. I mean, Northern Ireland, since the Good Friday Agreement, I often commend people in the Balkans because, having worked in North Kosovo as well, you don't see physical barriers between communities. A lot of the divisions are psychological. The interethnic boundary line between the Federation and the Republika Srpska is completely invisible. So on paper, you have the separation between the two entities. But when you're traveling around the country, there are no checkpoints. You don't have to show documentation. So in that sense, on the ground, the very complicated institutional structure, is more invisible, the cantons, etc. But that governance structure has become a massive burden. It's extremely complicated. If I'm right, the country has basically 13 free ministers of education. One in the Federation, one in the Republika Srpska, one in each of the 10 cantons, and then one in Brčko district, which is an autonomous unit in the northeast of the country. And you'll note that it doesn't have a minister of education at the state level because it's not deemed a state level competence. So you have this massive governance structure, which is very wasteful. Of course, nobody takes responsibility for dealing with the sort of day-to-day concerns of citizens. It's easy to sort of shift responsibility. The governance structures have been captured by political parties that are grounded in this sort of ethnic key, and that capture extends to judicial institutions, the media, and so Bosnia functions through a sort of day-to-day simultaneous conversations within sort of political parties, bickering and going backwards and forwards, and it's almost sort of a 6-dimensional chess on different layers. And the ones who suffer the most are citizens. And of course, what do citizens do when the state is not providing for them? They turn their backs and they leave. And Bosnia really faces a profound demographic crisis. Some of the estimates for how the population has shrunk particularly in the last decade, are quite shocking, and reversing that demographic trend is going to be very difficult.
So moving on from that, I think two things really come up. I mean, the first is what happened? Why was it that first decade seemed to be so successful, and then things started to fall into this stagnation and paralysis that we see today. And tied to that, and I suspect that the 2 points are tied. We have seen a lot of comments coming from Republika Srpska about secession, and that this has become a major issue within the country and a source of deep division. Are those two elements linked? And obviously, I think at this point we have to introduce another key figure in this story, which is that of Milorad Dodik, who has dominated Bosnian Serb politics for so long.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, that, as I said, there was, I think, an uneasiness about the bomb powers and how they were used, and a sense that there was this incompatibility with the sort of long-term goal which many had for BIH and still have for BIH, which was to, membership of the EU. And so there's been this transition in terms of how the international community engages with Bosnia away from that model based upon the office of the High Representative and using the bomb powers to bang heads together. And, when Lord Ashdown was High Representative, I mean, this was really sort of high octane engagement on a day-to-day basis with political leaders and almost, presenting fait accomplis and then, hoping that they might legitimize them or give them rubber stamp. And so there's been a shift away from that heavy engagement towards trying to encourage and induce compromises amongst Bosnia's politicians. And there have been some successes. I mean, when Bosnia was offered the prospect of visa liberalization, so its citizens could travel to the EU, to the Schengen area without having to queue up outside an embassy, then, politicians got their act together and the necessary reforms were adopted in, a fairly short time span. But those, the lingering divergences of vision about what BIH will be have just impacted fundamentally the prospects of moving forward. I mean, you mentioned Milorad Dodik as the most vocal proponent of, Dodik was once the darling of the international community, deemed a moderate, but over time, I think he's come to understand some of the electoral benefits of engaging with, often the most repulsive forms of Serb nationalism, and he's really, banged the drum of secession in the RS, and use various approaches, threatening to withdraw Serbs from state-level institutions, threatening to prevent, the state-level institutions operating on the territory of Republika Srpska, threatening to call referendums on independence. And of course, recently this has culminated, with his ignoring of the decisions of the High Representative. He's been found guilty because this was made a criminal offense by the High Representative. He's been banned from political office and no longer is the president of Republika Srpska. But the nature of politics in BIH is such is that in one respect, it doesn't really matter if you sit in elected office. The fact that he is the head of the SNSD, still the largest Bosnian Serb political party, and the control that he has through networks of patronage. I mean, there was an incredible amount of shock and surprise in Sarajevo in particular, probably in Banja Luka also, when the Americans, the Trump administration, decided to lift the sanctions that had been imposed against Dodik and members of his family and companies associated with him. And so Dodik remains the most influential Bosnian Serb political force. I mean, if you look at Dragan Čović, who's the leading Bosnian Croat figure, his control of the HDZ has meant that he's remained the most, regardless of which political office he's held, he's remained the most important Bosnian Croat politician. And so, the twin grievances of Bosnian Croats and Bosnian Serbs work together to hamstrung, the potential for finding compromises that could move the state forward. But 2006, the package of reforms that I mentioned, I mean, these were supported by Dodik and by Čović, by the HDZ and by the SNSD. At that juncture, they agreed to move forward with some quite fundamental reforms. But then you had politicians in Sarajevo like Haris Salajic who felt that they didn't go far enough to undo what they see as the injustices of Dayton, i.e. the existence of Republika Srpska. And so trying to untie that knot of competing visions about what BIH can be, the Serbs wanting more autonomy, the Croats wanting their own entity, and the Bosniaks wanting their, greater centralization of the state, has just proved extremely difficult. And with the weakening of the EU perspective, there isn't sufficient, there aren't sufficient incentives to make these difficult compromises. Even with the reform agenda that, is bringing, almost €1 billion into BIH, it's been hamstrung by, again, failure to reach compromise on key things. And so it's a constant headache about how to try and move forward with reform. And, it's in the coming decade, I don't see why it would be any different, because Bosnia remains hamstrung. There's a lot of wishful thinking in a way about, there's been various sort of rulings by the European Court of Human Rights on aspects of BIH's constitution. The most famous is arguably Sejdic Finci, a member of the Roma community and a member of the Jewish community, who, because of the constitution, can't run for the presidency, for instance, or the House of Peoples. You have to be a Bosniak, a Croat, or a Serb. And this was found to be discriminatory, and Bosnia, under its obligations towards the ECHR, should have, has to change its constitution if it wants to move forward. But that ruling, I think, dates back to 2008, 2009. And we haven't seen any progress in the, 16 years since. There are other rulings by the ECHR, all of which require, because of this combination of ethnicity and territory that go to the heart of how BIH is structured, various elements of those have been challenged in the courts, but yet there's no political will to implement the decisions. So, and the context in which, I don't see why political will would emerge in the coming years unless the EU offered a very, very tangible prospect of membership. But the problem with the EU perspective nowadays, and I think many political leaders in the region have almost internalized this, is it's that contradiction. People want the EU to act more geopolitically, geostrategically, and to make political decisions on membership. But the underlying logic of accession has always been about bringing countries into conformity with the acquis communautaire, making them undergo rigorous internal reforms. But if political leaders start to think that maybe they have a prospect of membership because the EU sees them as strategically important, then it sort of disincentivizes having to undertake all these challenging measures. So it's really that the region finds itself, not just BIH, but Serbia, Kosovo, the entire region finds itself in this slightly paradoxical situation.
This sort of returns back to the point that you'd sort of touched on a little bit earlier, but I think is worth going back to, which are these commentaries that we see that Bosnia is teetering on the brink of renewed violence. And you mentioned that you sort of see this every year. Likewise, this is for as long as I can remember, there have been people sort of saying, look, it really, really is on the edge now, that we're going to see violence, that we mustn't ignore Bosnia anymore. But just how do the dynamics of that work out? Because obviously people wouldn't be saying this if they didn't think that there was some sort of threat there, but it just doesn't seem to materialize, thankfully. And it certainly hasn't up till now. But maybe just sort of talk a little bit more about why, when people see these sort of commentaries, how they should really read it.
First and foremost, oftentimes these commentaries can be very self-serving. You raise the threat of war to try and lobby your congressman, or to try and influence US foreign policy, for instance. So I'm talking about the last sort of decade or so. So they can be very self-serving, and that they're not necessarily grounded on a clear sort of cold objective analysis about the security dynamics. I mean, obviously the one thing that has changed fundamentally is the regional context. I mean, the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina was defined by the participation of Serbia and Croatia. And that regional environment is very different. Croatia now is obviously an EU member state, member of NATO. That's not to say that it doesn't have keen interests in Bosnia and Herzegovina, but they use different mechanisms to try and give support to the Bosnian Croat constituency there, many of whom have EU passports by virtue of being Croatian citizens already, and therefore have less interest in the progress of Bosnia-Herzegovina. And obviously Serbia doesn't have an appetite for getting involved in a conflict in BIH from people I've spoken to in Belgrade, there's often a lot of hesitation about Dodik and some of the rhetoric, and it's really trying to make sure that it doesn't go too far, that Dodik doesn't overplay his hand. There's certainly political gain for Dodik by rousing this secessionist sentiment. There are certain political interests that that Serbs in Bosnia want to try and pursue, and part of the armory is threatening, to disengage with the state or to prevent the state functioning on that territory. But from my understanding of sitting in Belgrade, I don't see an appetite in Serbia politically, nor certainly not among the general population, to get embroiled in a conflict in Bosnia and Herzegovina. So whilst they do stand up for Serbian interests, Serb interests in BIH, the prospect of giving active support to a secessionist campaign, I don't foresee. And so that's really a fundamental difference to what we had in the 90s, where there was, the direct arming and involvement of paramilitary groups from the neighboring states. And I think, in that sense, Bosnia and Herzegovina sits in a more sort of positive regional context. It's far from perfect, but I think, it means that, you can arguably preclude some of the possibilities that 30 years ago were sort of lingering on the doorstep. These sort of claims that Bosnia is on the verge of war are very damaging. They're very damaging for people who live there. They're very damaging for investor sentiment, and they don't create any sense of momentum that we need to act now and we need to do this and we need to do that. That's a different challenge. How do we create momentum around the need for reform and whatnot? There have been cases in the region where crisis fuels engagement. I mean, if you think about 2011 in North Kosovo, really put in place the momentum towards the Brussels Agreement in 2013. But creating that momentum now in the Bosnia-Herzegovina context, it's very difficult to foresee how that could happen.
I hope you're finding this useful. If so, please do give it a like and perhaps subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. It all really helps. Many thanks. And now back to the interview. And I mean, there have been a lot of attempts that you and I, we've known each other for a long time. We've looked and worked on the Balkans for many years, and we have seen all these initiatives come and go to try and reform things. So on that note, I'm going to sort of put you on the spot now, because there is quite clearly a need for fundamental reform in Bosnia. You had mentioned about constitutional changes, that there was a sense that Dayton was something that was put in place to stop a war, but wasn't ultimately seen as the end of that sort of constitutional structure. What would need to be done as you see it? I mean, if you were given that power to sort of say, right, okay, this is what I think really needs to happen in Bosnia, how we get it back on track, how we fix the situation, what would it look like?
First and foremost, you're right. I've seen, I've taken part in so many initiatives, read so many policy papers, but the fundamental point we always come, there's lovely conceptions of BIH, which just has a state level and a municipal level. But then the fundamental question is, how do you get there? How do you, how do you persuade politicians to give up, sort of Turkey's voting for Christmas scenario? So it is very difficult to foresee. And this is the great tragedy that for me, the 2006 package that was on the table was really a very, obviously if your position is that the Republika Srpska should be abolished, it's going to be a non-starter. And I think this is a challenge of discussing reform within the BIH context, is that a lot of unpalatable things for people have to be accepted. The Republika Srpska will remain a factor will remain in existence in BIH. And how do we accommodate that within a state level structure? And that state level structure needs to be able to function more effectively. You can't just rely upon eternal coordination mechanisms to move the country forward. You're going to need to create a council of ministers that has a proper prime minister, can appoint his own cabinet. You need to create new state-level ministries, because the EU accession agenda requires, a focus on things like agriculture, science, technology. And these are things that were embraced 20 years ago. as a viable means forward. Making sure, as I said, that those rulings of the ECHR are taken into consideration, giving space for others within the House of Peoples, for instance, within the legislative institutions, maybe broadening the size, etc. I mean, fundamentally, and this is a very difficult. I don't like drawing lines on maps, but I think trying to find there's got to be some way to rationalize the institutional structures as well. And I don't know how you deal with that. The problem with Bosnia and Herzegovina is that often we just focus on the Serb dimension. But the Croat question has been equally problematic. Is there a way of rationalizing the cantons, for instance, in the federation to reduce their number? Because at the moment, the system of governance is just an incredible drain on the resources of the country. But there have to be steps to centralize the state level, and I think the argument has to be in Banja Luka. We accept, whether we like it or not, that the RS exists and will continue to exist. But at the same time, you need to embrace the ideas that you embraced 20 years ago, that there needs to be a strengthening at the state level if BIH wants to join the EU. And the EU is still, obviously in neighboring Serbia, the prospect of membership is less popular these days. But I think in BIH, it is seen as, that there is no other alternative for the country. And, people are seeing in their communities, people moving abroad, and I think this is a very sad state of affairs. The impending demographic crisis, it might not even be impending, it might be actual and real. Should really focus minds on the need to try and, the respective interests of the constituent peoples can still be played out and will still be at the heart of politics, unfortunately. There's a thing called a vital national interest, which has become essentially a veto power used by the different ethnicities to stop. Use of that mechanism has to be more tightly constrained and limited to certain key issues, because otherwise the system is just vulnerable to gridlock. Bosnia is not Belgium, where things keep functioning normally, even if there's no government in place. I mean, there need to be some of these stipulations that were created to try and safeguard and ease the concerns of the different parties. They need to be diluted in a certain way, because otherwise this gridlock is just going to the country will destroy itself from within by virtue of it's the old easy adage that if a country can't function, then it has no future. And that's the ultimate test of the package that is put in place. I mean, advocates of Dayton will always say Dayton was not supposed to be permanent, and that's the sort of classic defense argument you hear. It was to stop a war, and we would move on from that Dayton Constitution to something that is more in line with sort of European best practice.
So I don't really want to end on a really negative note, because I think, as we started out by talking about, I mean, the war that took place in Bosnia was particularly bloody and brutal. I think the fact that it is 30 years ago means that there will probably be quite a lot of viewers who may not have been alive when it was taking place, or were very young. I can remember it very clearly because it was such a horrific conflict, and it was taking place in that context of the post-Cold War era.
Mm.
I was in my early 20s. It was it was shocking sights to see. But what would you say? You spend a lot of time in Bosnia. You know the country well. What are some of the brighter points that maybe we can sort of end with to bring out to people who probably haven't visited the country or don't know it?
I mean, I've during the course of this year, I've been talking to a lot of people from different backgrounds, trying to collect reflections about Bosnia 30 years on from the end of the war. And the one thing that the people who've impressed me the most are those who get involved in civic activism around things like rivers and forests and mining projects, because Bosnia and Herzegovina is arguably one of the most beautiful countries in Europe. The rivers, the mountains, its natural beauty is spectacular, and of course, it's largely remained off the tourist map. Now, I'm not keen on having BIH flooded with tourists, but I think for those who can, who can really sell, there's a lot of appeal these days, sort of returning to nature and getting out into the great outdoors and going hiking. And unfortunately, a lot of the demine, one of the other things I didn't mention, the number of landmines that were left in the country after the war. There've been extensive demining activities now, and so large parts of the country are safe to go hiking. You've got Olympic skiing just outside Sarajevo. You've got the Neretva, beautiful rivers, valleys, wild horses in the west of the country. And I think people are starting to become more aware about the need to uphold and protect that. And so it doesn't matter if you're a Bosniak, a Croat, or a Serb, you will come out and protest against the construction of a small-scale hydroelectric power plant. I interviewed some people from near to Maglai who are protesting against a potential lithium mining project. And, and they're from different communities. But it's irrelevant. They fought against each other during the war, but what they're bounded together by now is a concern about the exploitation of their natural assets. And I think that's absolutely vital that, people appreciate and respect what BIH has in terms of history, heritage, culture, natural beauty, and tries to find ways to nurture it because it creates livelihoods. It creates a sense of pride in place. I remember talking to a politician or a councillor from from Novi Pazar in southwest Serbia, again, another area of outstanding natural beauty. And he said, if young people spend all their time on their telephones or their tablets or their computers, then it doesn't matter if they live here or they live in some German city. So we need to make young people appreciate the nature around them. I think the artistic scene is extremely vibrant. A lot of artists finding novel ways to engage with the past, and trying to use art with a sort of social purpose in mind as a rehabilitation. There's a lot of creativity around how the war is remembered. Alternative approach to memorialization. And these are all from young people who, as you say, were born after the war. And it's easy to be pessimistic about some of the young people because they've grown up in, an education system that doesn't teach different approaches or different perspectives on history. They've grown up in maybe, fairly sort of monocultural communities. But technology gives them access to the outside world, and I think they've started to. I think we're getting to that generation who starts to ask the questions of their forefathers, the previous generations. Why did the war happen? Why did you do this? And what have you done since the war to try and make it better? I can't say I don't think there's a critical mass there yet, but there are certainly young people who are beginning to find ways to ask that question. And so, that makes me much more optimistic about at the community level. I think, the war in Bosnia was very different in different parts of the country. I've had the pleasure to travel to almost every different town or city. And I think, the local reality today is also very different I remember interviewing a young student from Yaitse, and, they'd stood up to the existence of two schools under one roof, which is where, children, Bosniaks and Bosnian Croat children, they either go at different times of the day or they go to different parts of the school. And they said, look, we don't want this in our school. This is enough. We don't want to be segregated, and often these segregations are being driven by politicians who want to maintain that reality of a divided BIH. Now, I'm not so optimistic to believe that all that civic momentum will convert into new political movements anytime soon, but it does make society more resilient. It makes it more difficult for politicians to segregate people, and that gives me some hope for the future. As I said, I think the glue that holds this all together is going to be a really tangible EU perspective and citizens saying, this demographic crisis, I hope, focuses the minds a little bit because, there is no point having a society if everybody's only coming back as members of the diaspora for summer or Christmas or whatnot. I'm not a pessimist about BIH. Nor am I romanticizing what I think the future can hold. But I think there are a lot of positive things going on there. If you get beneath the day-to-day politics can be tremendously consuming. And I think, you can spend your life just following what he said, she said, and it's exhausting over time. It sort of helps sometimes just to talk to people from different backgrounds or step away and try and look at look at the local level in particular, the municipal level, because after all, that's the level that affects day-to-day lives of citizens. So I think that's a more optimistic finish than you were you were maybe expecting.
Ian, look, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. I mean, it really has been great talking to you, and I think you presented such a clear picture of where we stand in Bosnia, for good and for bad, at this crucial point. And I think many watching who know the region will certainly be hoping for the best for Bosnia. I mean, as you said, and like you, I spent a lot of time there. It is an incredibly beautiful country, and it has so much to offer. And I think, we would all like to see it be able to move forward in a way that all the different peoples of the country, not just Serbs, Croats and Bosniaks, but also members of the Roma community, of the Jewish community, of other communities, can all participate. But Ian, thank you so much for talking to us.
Thank you, James. Thank you for the questions. Enjoyed it.
I hope you found that useful. If so, here are some more videos that you might find interesting. Thanks so much, and see you in the next video.